Brethren, ladies and gentlemen, hello, I am Brother Sean Michael Gorley, a Master Mason in the jurisdiction of the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania. I'm also a writer for the Working Tools Masonic magazine, a book review editor for Bannack Masonic Library, and their publication, Rising Point International Masonic Review. And by profession, I am a freelance editor with Lewis Masonic. First off, before I begin, I would like to thank Brother Albert McClellan for inviting me to present this lecture. And I would also like to take a minute to thank the following people and give credit where credit is due. Whether the following people realize it or not, they have been a huge asset to me and in one way or another have aided me in this endeavor to bring more light to the topic of Freemasonry and the public school systems. First, a hearty thanks go out to the following brethren from the Masonic Society Forum: Brother Steve Vedra, George Pursley, Christopher Rodkey, Adam Kendall, Nathan Brindle, Mark Tabbert, and Kevin Olson. From the Library of the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania, free and accepted Masons, Miss Kathy Giamo and Miss Glennis Waldman. From the Bannack Masonic Library, Brothers Mitchell Ozog and Carl Gruby. From Bannack Historic Lodge, number 3777, Brother Dave Pruitt. Brother William Reiniger and the entire board of directors and students from the Pennsylvania Academy of Masonic Knowledge. Regrettably, I will most likely never be able to put into words just how huge an impact they have had not only on my Masonic education, but my life and my professional life as well. I hope someday to return the favor to you all, and if not, I hope to have the same impact on many a brother when I have the chance to do what these men have all done for me. Therefore, thank you, Bill, Academy, board members, for pushing me to learn and grow. It has paid off more than you will ever know. Now, moving on to the topic of the lecture at hand, which is entitled Freemasonry and Public Education. As any Freemason knows, one of the most important aspects, as well as it being an obligation, is that we should always be in search of more light, light being the symbol of knowledge. In Pennsylvania ritual, the Fellowcraft degree states that we should be a lover of the arts and sciences and take every opportunity to improve ourselves in such. And more specifically, we are told to engage in the study of grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. In other words, we as Freemasons are always to improve ourselves in the previous areas collaboratively known as the 7 liberal arts and sciences. My objective in this presentation on the topic of Freemasonry and public education is to highlight the important role that Freemasonry played in the development of the public school system, as well as give some examples of the biggest key figures in it, and to show what their actions did to benefit our country in making it a more educated place. As most scholarly research into the development of the public school systems tends to ignore the large role Freemasonry played in the movement towards a more educated people. Freemasonry, as we know, is the world's oldest known fraternity, but just how old is it? From a research standpoint, no one can definitively say. It could be merely just shy of 300 years old, or it could date back to the days of Noah. I am certain that the beginning of our craft will always be debated until hard, undeniable evidence is produced. And personally, I hope it never is, for the simple fact that not knowing keeps us yearning, researching, and learning more along the way every day on the quest to find out, which I find to be a beautiful thing. However, for the purpose of this lecture, I will stick to the date June 24, 1717, as this is the date that Freemasonry came out to the public as a non-operative fraternity, meaning we were not merely stone workers any longer. We were a fraternity of gentlemen with the first organized Grand Lodge that would govern the surrounding existing lodges of the same. The lecture is not necessarily concerned with when Freemasonry began. It is concerned with the educational aspects and how they relate to the public at large, and more specifically here in the United States of America. From the date of June 24, 1717 and on, the charge to improve ourselves in the 7 liberal arts and sciences has always been a part of the craft of Freemasonry. And why I picked this specific topic to research is quite simple. From the Dark Ages of Europe and into the Enlightenment era, and even into the earliest 20th century, a proper education was mainly reserved for specific archetypes of people, and that being the wealthy and the clergy. Even if a person did receive some sort of education, it was a very limited one. So how did we go from that to the present public school systems of today seemed to me quite interesting, and obviously, as an always researching Freemason, which I am proud to be, intrigued me enough to write this paper on the topic, and it is exactly what I intend to pass on to the audience of this work. If there is one thing the craft of Freemasonry truly is about, it is about the education of the individual man to become a more informed, knowledgeable, and moral person within the society he resides. In other words, to make good men better. But how would a man achieve this? Obviously, to us, it would be through the process of educating himself in the 7 liberal arts and sciences, as these 7 subjects directly or indirectly lead to all matters of a true education. We must remember that when Freemasonry was in its infancy, it was originally used as a means for men of all backgrounds, religions, and races to meet privately so that they may learn from each other, teach each other, and discuss the several liberal arts and sciences in private. Because at the time of Freemasonry's infancy, discussing such matters in an open public, much less doing it with a person of a differing religion or race, could get one into major trouble in the early 18th century England, Scotland, and Europe. There are still places in this world today where this is still the case. However, back then, everything imaginable was under strict control of the churches, whether it be Catholic or English Protestant churches, as well as the aristocracies of these above-mentioned locations. It was no different in the early colonies of the United States, wherein they were still within the rule of the churches and governments of Europe. Now, let me ask you, can you imagine living in a time when free thought and the subject of your education were under such strict control? Could you imagine having to hide the fact that you were a Freemason because in certain places this was considered a crime of the most serious offense and punishable by, quite frankly, horrific actions? That free thought and educating yourselves beyond the teachings of the church or your particular trade would be so wrong in the eyes of the law and the church. This is the part of the presentation wherein I hope that everyone who is watching this takes a second to think back, realize, and be thankful for our ancestral brethren for the struggles and sacrifices they made, as well as their dedication to our beloved craft of Freemasonry and education. I will be bold enough to state here that the world we know now would be an entirely different place if it were not for our brothers of the past, those rebel thinkers that wished to change the world, to enable free thought and curious minds to learn what they wished. I, however, am in no way stating that Freemasonry is solely responsible for the public educational system, but there were a lot of key players that were not Freemasons. But, as I will point out, Freemasons have had a massive impact on public education that I believe has been ignored by previous research into the topic of how the American public school system took shape. Someday, when I lay my working tools down and return to that celestial lodge, I hope that I may be wise enough to thank our past brethren for their toils and sacrifices, because whether or not one agrees with me here, they have helped develop many a brethren of yesterday and today to be who they are, including myself and anyone watching this. Because if you are, you do have a desire to further your education, to be a better person for your family, society, and lodge. And I hope that we may all be wise enough to pass on what we have learned to those whom come before us in the upcoming generations, so that what our brethren of the past have done for us will never cease to exist. Now that I have hopefully gained your attention with the passion I have for this topic, I will get down to the business with the facts and examples of exactly what I have already said thus far, as well as lay out some of the history of just how Freemasonry helped develop our public school system into what it is, as I feel that researchers in general do not give enough credit to our fraternity for the large role it has played in this area. More important than the influence on Freemasons themselves was the influence Freemasonry had on the fraternity, on the society around it. The goal of Masonry is to make good men better, and to make the world a better place by encouraging its members to become more responsible fathers, sons, and citizens, and thereby becoming better examples to others. This is precisely what was going on in colonial America. Men who had no formal education were being introduced to the ideas of enlightenment, either directly as Masons themselves or simply by association with Freemasons. When the brethren realized that how they had learned to do these things in a wild, unsettled group of colonies was in part due to their relationship and activities within Freemasonry, is it no wonder that Masonry put the whole weight of its influence behind the public school system when it came to take shape. Most colonists did not actually read Locke, Hume, Voltaire, Diderot, or Rousseau any more than British soldiers did. Through the lodges, however, the currents of thoughts associated with such philosophers became universally accessible. It was largely through the lodges that ordinary colonists learned of that lofty premise called the rights of man. It was through the lodges that they learned the concept of the perfectibility of society, and the New World seemed to offer a species of blank slate, a species of laboratory in which social experiment was possible and the principles enshrined by Freemasonry could be applied in practice. In colonial America, prior to the public school system, there were schools of sorts already in place within the colonies. However, they were very limited. These included dame schools, in which a woman taught the neighboring children for a fee. Town schools, which the community hired a teacher, and the parents paid a tuition fee or tax in some places. The Latin grammar school, which was reserved for the more well-to-do, that would teach boys Latin and Greek in order to prepare them for college. However, females were not permitted to attend even if they were of a wealthy family. And the primer school, which was the most popular, in which the children learned not much more than how to read and write, although not every child was able to attend a primer school. Interestingly, the primer school is where the child's prayer, "Now I lay me down to sleep," first appeared. The majority of the population in colonial America lived along its coastlines for simple reasons, being that it was where the chances for employment, social gatherings, churches, and, you guessed it, Masonic lodges were located. In this period, and as the populations moved westward, the only chance a man or a child had in an education was mainly limited to three things. 1. they took apprenticeship in a trade. 2, they were educated in biblical teachings through the church. And 3, the Masonic Lodge. Unless you were from a wealthy family, these were the main ways an everyday average person could achieve any education at all. But as I mentioned already, these men of the lodge were slowly realizing how their Masonic education was affecting the world around them for the better. As early as 1732, the Masons became vocal promoters of free public schools in the colonies, and Freemasonry was slowly laying down the foundations of our American system. If the men were getting an education through their association with the Masonic Lodge, or from the association with a Freemason, why couldn't their children get a better education? Why should a formal education be reserved only for the wealthy? Why shouldn't all children have the privilege to be educated? After all, look what good and what a huge impact a Masonic education was doing for the communities during this time. The lodges sought to civilize, to teach manners and decorum, to augment the order and harmony of civil society. They taught men to speak in public, to keep records, to pay taxes, to be tolerant, to debate freely, to vote, to moderate their feasting, and to give lifelong devotions to the other citizens of their order. To no order in society is the encouragement of public schools and the advancement of knowledge more valuable than to the fraternity of Freemasons. The liberal arts and sciences were formally taught in lodges, and the brethren imparted the instruction to their children and many others more than was found in any except Masonic families. Why wouldn't this be a desire of those Freemasons? These men would not have been upholding their obligations by merely doing nothing. So as any good Mason should do, they moved to assist in the movement for free publication for all children based on what they were learning, all by spending only mere hours in a lodge room per month. One of the earliest schools in the colonial days, that is now known as the University of Pennsylvania, is a school that was a product of Brother Benjamin Franklin's actions in aiding the betterment of the education of the public. I think it's safe to say that Franklin had no idea his simple little school would develop into one of the most respected Ivy League universities in the country from its humble beginnings. It started out as being different from all others. Even though its influence was confined to just the area of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, it had no counterpart in Europe and had no religious motive. Students in attendance of this school were of Latin grammar school age, or in present terms, of high school age. However, unlike its counterparts, Franklin's school had the intention of not only preparing its students for college, but for normal life as well. This took place in 1749 and was known as the Public Academy of Philadelphia. The interesting fact about Franklin's new school was that its counterparts were Harvard, William and Mary, Yale, and Princeton, which at the time were geared only for the education of the clergy rather than educating their students for everyday life in subjects such as business, public service, and general education of the 7 liberal arts and sciences. The curriculum advanced by Franklin included navigation, surveying, agriculture, the spoken languages of the day, natural history, chemistry, physics, government, and history. This initial curriculum over the mid-18th century was gradually forced to mold as time progressed, but his school is pointed to as the first American academy, which was the transition institution from the Latin grammar school and the English grammar school to the modern high school. Franklin School eventually became the College of Philadelphia and is now known as the University of Pennsylvania, once it had been made private in 1791 after the revolutionary fervor had finally died down. The 18th century was an incredible time for both the university and the young American Republic. The university saw a rise to the first medical school in the colonies in 1765 when John Morgan organized a medical faculty to the school. Some of our new country's earliest law lectures under its brand new government were given in 1790 at the university. By the end of the first half of the century of the school, it had been educating the leadership of not only its own school, but for the new nation as well. 9 signers of the Declaration of Independence and 11 signers of the Constitution were associated with the university in one way or the other. One of the most coveted Ivy League universities in this country, as well as America's first high school and university, came to be all because one Freemason saw the importance of an equal education for all. A man that knew that if our soon-to-become country was to succeed, it needed to have educated, wise citizens for this to be possible. One of the most popular and recognized Freemasons of all time felt so strongly on this that he included it in his farewell address. Brother George Washington states, "Promote then, as an object of primary importance, institutions for the general diffusion of knowledge. In proportion as the structure of a government gives force to public opinion, it is essential that public opinion should be enlightened." The father of our new nation, a man that fought so hard for so long to see that we had a free country under our own rule, knew that if the country was going to survive, education of its people was crucial to making this happen. In post-revolutionary America, when the newly freed country was finally under its own rule, is when the movement of a free public education really started to take shape. Brothers officially sponsored educational endeavors that reached beyond the fraternity. This encouragement of broader education seemed to link the fraternity with the post-revolutionary vision of an enlightened society, built around equality and openness, values that brothers came to see expressed even in their order structures. By supporting, learning, and by teaching and embodying Republican relationships, Masonry seemed to be upholding and advancing the revolutionary experiment itself. Moving on into the early 19th century, a Freemason that also had an enormous impact on public education was Brother DeWitt Clinton. Clinton had the most impact on the public education system while during his many terms as mayor of New York City. Clinton was a great man during this time and accomplished many things throughout his life. He was a very prominent Freemason, being very involved in the York Rite, as well as being Grand Master of Masons for the state of New York, as well as the head of the York Rite of Freemasonry, more specifically, chapter and commandery, in his time as a Mason. He was also the governor of New York, as well as the Grand Master during the Morgan Affair of Western New York. Now, going back to the topic of education. Clinton made his biggest impact on education while serving as mayor of New York City between the years 1803 and 1815. He was also serving as lieutenant governor of the state during the latter portion of that time period. Clinton is referred to as the father of the New York City public school system. There were many Masonic lodges in New York City, and during Clinton's reign in not only government but Freemasonry as well, New York City lodges had already supported 50 children in the city's free schools from 1808 to 1818, providing clothing also when it was needed. Later, Independent Royal Arch Lodge, a participant in the free public school program, also agreed to sponsor a child in Ceylon under the care of a missionary brother, requesting that he be called Hiram Abiff. Such lodge activities were supplemented by Grand Lodge charity. The more than 80% of that year's total expenditures, and by the individual giving upon which Royal relied. To say that DeWitt Clinton was a Freemason who took the values and lessons of our craft and saw a bigger picture on how to improve our very young country would be an understatement of the largest variety. The following is an excerpt from an address given by Clinton himself during his term as governor that will give some deeper insight into his thoughts on public education. Quote, "In casting a view over the civilized world, we find an universal accordance in opinion on the benefits of education, but the practical exposition of this opinion exhibits a deplorable contrast. While magnificent colleges and universities are erected and endowed and dedicated to literature, we behold few liberal appropriations for disusing the blessings of knowledge among all descriptions of people. The fundamental error of Europe has been to confine the light of knowledge to the wealthy and the great, while the humble and the depressed have been as sedulously excluded from its participation as the wretched criminal immured in a dungeon is from the light of heaven. The cardinal mistake is not only to be found in the institutions of the old world and the condition of its inhabitants, but it is to be seen in most of the books which have been written on the subject of education." End quote. From this excerpt of his speech, it was obviously that the people of the time were learning the mistakes of the past in relation to limited educational opportunities. To further my view on this, I again will quote the next few sentences of the speech by Clinton that I feel are pertinent to the point I have just made. Quote, "The celebrated Locke, whose treatises on government and the human understanding have crowned him with immortal glory, devoted to the powers of his mighty intellect the elucidation of education. But in the very threshold of his book we discover this radical error. His treatise is professedly intended for the children of gentlemen. If those of that rank, says he, are, by education, once set right, they will quickly bring the rest into order. And he appears to consider the education of other children as of little importance." End quote. I would have loved to be in attendance at this speech made by Clinton. This was a new country, a country of rebels, and that had an earnest desire to be different than those of their ancestors, to have an education that could make all men free, that would give the intelligent son of a tradesman or the poor child of a laborer an honest and equal chance to be whatever it was he desired to be, by allowing him and others of the same to be educated without fear of the church or authorities, like had never been seen before. It appeared that the post-revolutionary country was indeed advancing itself further after it had fought for its independence by the realization that in order to prosper, succeed, and grow, it needed to be an educated country. The post-revolutionary experiment was paying off. Let me pose this question for consideration for a second. Where would we be in our time if it were not for the toils, sacrifices, and fights of men like DeWitt Clinton, George Washington, and Ben Franklin? All Freemasons who fought hard for what our craft stands for. All three helped bring that within reach of the general public. Moving westward to what was at the time considered to be the West, to Michigan. we have yet another remarkable instance of a Freemason fighting for an education for all. His name was Brother and Judge Augustus Woodward. Woodward was the first of 3 federally appointed judges for a brand new territory of Michigan. Woodward drafted the Act of 1817, an act that established the University of Michigan. However, it did not start out as a full university, nor was it in its present home in Ann Arbor as it is today. It was originally located at the corner of Congress and Bates Streets in the village of Detroit. The building, 2 stories high, 40 feet high by 20 feet wide. Mount Zion Lodge number 1 met on the 2nd floor of this same building. So what was the beginnings of the University of Michigan started out on the 1st floor. Woodward had a grand plan for his university, but at the time there was not enough money to fund anything close to what Woodward had dreamed up. So for a time, what would become the University of Michigan had rather humble beginnings as just a grade school. In a search for more funding for his big idea, Woodward, being a Freemason, he turned to his brethren of Mount Zion Lodge number 1, which was using the 2nd story of the same building for their lodge, for financial support. And on September 15th, 1817, the lodge met and voted to approve the funds of a sum of $250 to aid the school, payable at $50 per year. Of the total amount of money subscribed to aid the school and turn it into what it became, 2/3 of that came from the Mount Zion Lodge and its members. Within a year, both a primary school and a classical academy were functioning within it. In 1837, the year Michigan became a state. Its new constitution declared a do-over and recreated the school into the University of Michigan and relocated it to Ann Arbor. Brother and Judge Augustus Woodward, the driving force behind what became the University of Michigan, was also very close with another famous figure of the times, and in a letter from Woodward to Thomas Jefferson, Woodward wrote, quote, "The arrangement and classification of all human knowledge is essentially associated with its future advance and improvement." End quote. At this point in the lecture, I have highlighted some rather large institutions of higher education that were the result of Freemasonry. I will continue to do so, but at this point I would like to point out that not all actions by Freemasons resulted in the formations of major universities. There are countless examples of lesser known actions by Freemasons which aided in the education of children. I have chosen one in particular lodge to highlight in this lecture because of the fact that if I named them all and gave the history of all of them, this paper would be considerably longer than it is. The one I have chosen is Bannack Historic Lodge number 3777 because of its unique history as well as the fact that the 1st floor of it was used as a schoolhouse up until 1951. The Bannack Lodge was officially opened in 1871 as Bannack Lodge number 16, but the lodge building was not built until 1874 by its members and was originally planned to host the school on the 1st floor, leaving the lodge room to operate upstairs. This is yet another example that Freemasons knew of and realized the importance of an education. Although the combination of Masonic lodge and schoolhouse was unusual in the early Wild West, it was a very appropriate and positive expression of the fraternity's support of education. The lodge/schoolhouse still stands today and has been fully preserved by the Freemasons. On June 23, 2000, the Grand Lodge of Masons of Montana officially chartered Bannack Lodge as the first historic lodge in the state to help preserve the building and heritage of Masonry. The lodge still offers lifetime memberships in which the funds go toward the upkeep and maintenance of this historic lodge that housed one of the first schools in the early West. In keeping with the flow of this presentation, I again move westward to highlight the father of the public school system and education in California, Brother John Swett. John Swett was born in 1830 in Pittsfield, New Hampshire. His father had been a teacher, as the school systems in the eastern U.S. had already started taking shape, and Swett had luckily inherited the traits which would characterize a successful instructor. He attended a school as a young man in Randolph, Massachusetts, where he enjoyed the privilege of attending lectures by Ralph Waldo Emerson and Theodore Parker. These great teachers laid the foundation for a cultivated, refined taste in their eager listener. Later in his life, Swett wrote that one of his teachers did something more than textbook recitations. He talked, he explained, he illustrated, he even laughed. How genial he was. Arithmetic was made easy, grammar was made sweet to the taste, and the whole world seemed delightful. Swett attended many local academies and was an educated young man. He even obtained a teaching certificate by the age of 17 and enrolled himself into a newly opened teacher training institute. However, at that time, he had not fully decided to take on a career in teaching. After all, it was the mid-1800s, and unlike many others, he felt the fever of the California gold rush, in which he decided to partake in, albeit very briefly. Upon arriving in San Francisco in 1853, after a long sail at sea from Boston, Swett worked for a few months with little reward, working in the mines and on farms. Destitute and broke, he began teaching in San Francisco as public principal of the Rincon School. He remained at that position until 1862, which was also the year he became a Freemason, joining Phoenix Lodge number 144 of San Francisco. In retrospect, the new state of California seemed to be an ideal place to establish a free and comprehensive public school system like the ones that were already in place but in the U.S. by the mid-1800s. With the gold rush going on, the money was there, and with that, California attracted teachers as well as would-be teachers to the state. The only thing was that standards needed to be set for a thriving and beneficial set of school systems to operate. California's first constitution in 1849 called simply for a system of common schools, the term in use at the time for free elementary schools supported by public money, and an elected state superintendent. The delegate at the Constitutional Convention set the term at 3 months because they thought it would be easier to fund the shorter term than the longer one. But they did not write funding procedures or guidelines into this Constitution. Brother Swett was elected to the position of State Superintendent of Public Schools in 1862 and remained in that position until 1867. In 1863, he founded the California Teachers Association, and his call for this led to the California Educational Society, which in 1875 became the California Teachers Association. The most notable work of his administration was the drafting and securing of the passage of the Revised School of Law, which became the permanent foundation of the free public school system in California. This included securing the passing of laws creating a state board of education, providing teachers' institutes where poorly equipped teachers might get help, organize the schools into grades, establishing school libraries, providing for the certification of teachers, and laid out the financial basis for the support of public education. Before the close of his term, he had abolished tuition and made public schools absolutely free in all districts for at least 5 months each year. He succeeded in having school boards build better schoolhouses, secured necessary increases in teacher salary, and lengthened the school year. John Swett obviously dedicated his life to the public school system of California, with the small exception of when he worked in the mines and farms, and that was a very brief period in his long and distinguished life. Up until close to the time of his death, he continually served to ensure that the schools were the very best they could be, because through his own education, as well as his Masonic education, he realized the importance of ensuring the best education possible for the next generations to come, and the positive impact on our great country this would make. However, one of the most important ends accomplished by Mr. Swett in later years was the organization of a normal department for the fitting of graduates from high school to become teachers. As a result of this enterprise, nearly 1/2 of the public school teachers of the city of San Francisco are graduates of this institution. In 1872, Mr. Swett read a paper before the National Education Association at Boston against the continued re-examination of teachers and the annual election of teachers. It was remarkable as being the first educational address on record in the United States on this subject. It attracted marked attention all over the country. Upon the death of Brother John Swett in 1913, he was eulogized as the father of free public education in California, and as one of the many individuals responsible for bringing the Eastern ideals of public education to the Western states. The public school system is something we take for granted now, but there was a reason I decided to use the date June 24, 1717. and move forward in the timeline of this lecture, and that is to make another point. Before that date, going clear back to the Middle Ages, illiteracy was the most accepted norm. There was almost 100% certainty that most people would ever receive any form of what we would consider an education today. Even after Gutenberg invented the printing press, there was a little better chance to be educated. But even that was under strict control of the churches of the day, as well as the nobility. Most people were laborers for nobility of some type, and in the eyes of that nobility, not much different from cattle. There were no public schools or colleges, or much less anything close to that, with the exception of seminaries, monasteries, or apprenticeships in a trade. And it was apprenticeship in one particular trade that merged so very well with education beyond merely constructing a building, and that was the trade of masonry, which, as we know, developed into Freemasonry, officially announcing itself on that 24th day of June in 1717. That it was no longer just a builder's guild, it was way more than that. And as some of those Freemasons traveled across the Atlantic, they brought with them the desire to learn, teach, and better themselves and the world around them by means of an education. As I have pointed out earlier, some of these Freemasons knew what they were doing, but most Freemasons back then, whether they knew it or not, were contributing in the making of a civil society. What was being practiced in lodge was also being carried over to the outside world. The civility, equality, free thought, conflict resolution, and education are all great examples of why we as Freemasons now should practice outside of lodge what we have learned within. Brethren, ladies, gentlemen, in wrapping up this lecture, I truly hope that I have educated you on a subject too often overlooked by past research into the public education system of the United States. And that is the enormous part that the Freemasons and Freemasonry played in the development of it. If you have viewed this, the next time your local lodge is holding fundraisers for scholarships, children's leadership conferences, less fortunate children whose parents may be struggling financially, or in any way attempting to raise money for their local school district, I pray that you will remember watching this video and give as generously, not just monetarily, but in any way that you possibly can. Because without the education of our future generations, we as a nation and as a world will have failed if we have not given our best to them as our forefathers have given to us. Thank you.